Ghetto gang, salute to you. As always, thankful to the Most High for all the lessons and all the blessings being given to my family, and very happy and appreciative for all the lessons and blessings passed to you and your tribe. Before we start today's Bible study, I thought it'd be dope for us to get a bit more understanding on the Maccabean revolt for those who may not understand, it being quote unquote non-canonical and this story being more found in the Apocrypha than the actual quote unquote modern day versions of the Bible that most people have in their house, so they might not understand. So we're going to check out this quick video from Kings and Generals. Shout to them. They do amazing work. Let's go.
The image of the menorah and its iconic 8 candles shining through the dark winter night is one of the most visually recognizable aspects of traditional Jewish.
Now, some people use 8 candles. Some people use 7. Some people use 9. I personally use a 7 candle holder because the miracle is the 7 additional days that the candles burned, not the one day that they were supposed to have oil, but the 7 additional days. So, but we'll let them continue.
Culture. But from where does this ancient holiday ritual stem? To answer, we must go back 2,200 years to a time when the descendants of Alexander the Great ruled in the land of Judea, and tell a story of the ancient Jewish people's struggle to win liberty against the forces of the Hellenic world. Our sponsors allow us to release videos regularly without missing a beat, so shout out to the offers only came the Assyrians, and subsequently ruling were in terminal decline. Waste time. Were in terminal decline. And
there we go.
By the era of classical antiquity, the independent kingdoms of Israel and Judah were in terminal decline. As a result, the history of the Jewish people soon came to be defined by the carousel of foreign empires that took turns conquering and subsequently ruling the ancestral Hebrew homeland. First came the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, who ruled the Jews with a reasonably fair and light hand. Finally, in 332 BC, the Macedonian phalanxes of Alexander would steamroll the Achaemenid Empire out of existence, establishing Classical Greek as the dominant language and culture of the Near East. It is here that the Jewish people became subjects of the Greek world. When Alexander died, his massive Macedonian empire fractured into several monarchies, ruled by his closest comrades and later their descendants. These so-called Diadochi kingdoms were constantly at war with one another, and the region of Judea, being situated in the borderland between the Ptolemies of Egypt and Seleucids of Syria, became a battleground where the two Macedonian dynasties jockeyed for power and influence. Despite this, life remained fairly peaceful for the Hebrews. The Hellenistic kings generally used the same light touch the Persians had, interfering very little in the region's culture, religion, and internal politics. The Jewish people were ruled semi-autonomously by a high priest of the Judaic faith, who handled matters both religious and secular from the Great Temple of Jerusalem. In 198 BC, Antiochus III had finally expelled the Ptolemies out of Judea, putting the region firmly under the suzerainty of the Seleucid Empire. He lowered taxes and affirmed the Jewish people's freedom to live by their own faith and laws, and for now, Judea was content. Throughout world history, we often see subject peoples of a multi-ethnic empire willingly adopt the language and customs of said empire's rulers in an attempt to improve social mobility.
And that's exactly what happened with the Hebrews, Judeans, with the Hebrews, because they were under the impression, many of them were under the impression, not all, but many of them had the impression that if they got down, they wouldn't have to lay down, and that they would be allowed more freedoms or more upward mobility in society, more freedom of movement in society, less of an eye or less of a stare from the government and the government's officials, less constant monitoring if they would but take on the customs of the new conquerors.
So many Jewish peoples began to practice the Greek culture of their suzerains. This phenomenon, known as Hellenization, was perpetuated mainly by the upper strata of Jewish society, namely the wealthy priests, merchants and aristocrats in urban Jerusalem. The Hellenization process was expedited in 175 BC, when the culturally traditionalist high priest, Ananias III, was deposed by his Philhellene brother Joshua, better known by his Greek name Jason. Jason would go on to wield his power as high priest to begin transforming Jerusalem into a classically Greek city by building a gymnasium and an ephebeium, essentially community centers for Greek education and learning. He also sent Jewish athletes to compete in a mimic.
Yeah, it's not like a gymnasium we think of today, though it may have also had a center for athletics. Back then, they would call the entire school of learning a gymnasium for the younger men.
Of the Olympic Games, hosted by the king in Tyre. There he offered a sacrificial tribute to the Greek demigod Hercules, to whom the games were dedicated. Perhaps his most radical policy was to allow non-Jews in Jerusalem to set idols of their gods within the holy temple itself. The fact that the high priest was openly tolerating and even promoting the polytheistic gods was deeply disturbing to many Jews who clung to their monotheist faith. This sentiment was especially strong in the poorer, rural communities of Judea, who had clung far closer to Orthodox Judaism. A strained situation was made worse in 175 BC, when one Antiochus IV Epiphanes became the Seleucid Basileus. Various ancient accounts describe him as a proto-Nero or Commodus, that is to say, erratic. His sobriquet,
Basileus, just means that he became the vassal, he became the vicar, he became the head guy, almost seen like a god or deity over the people now.
Epiphanes meant manifested from God, but among his people he was secretly known by a variation of the title, Epimanes, which meant madman. It was him who in the first year of his rule supported Jason's coup against Ananias III, hoping a pro-Greek high priest would help Hellenize the Jews. However, only 3 years later, Antiochus decided that Jason wasn't Hellenizing Judea fast enough, so helped replace him with an even more pro-Hellenic priest, Menelaus. With that matter settled, Antiochus then marched with his armies into Egypt, aiming to double the size of his empire by seizing the Ptolemaic heartland. While the king was preoccupied, Jason seized his opportunity and returned to Jerusalem, initiating a counter-coup and expelling the deeply unpopular Menelaus. However, Antiochus's campaign was cut short when the Roman Republic intervened on behalf of the Ptolemies. Unable to match the strength of the legion, the king was forced to retreat to Syria. Already utterly humiliated by Rome, Antiochus's mood turned wrathful when he found out that his subjects in Jerusalem had rebelled. He stormed Jerusalem with his army, slaying the supporters of Jason and reinstating his puppet Menelaus as high priest. He then left Apollonius in charge of subduing the city, who accomplished his job by dismantling the walls of Jerusalem and building a fort named Acra on the nearby hill of Ophel, so everyone could gaze upwards and see the symbol of King Antiochus's power. Rather than leaving good enough alone, Antiochus began to actively exterminate Judaism, forbidding the people of Judea from observing the Sabbath, circumcising their sons, or performing other rituals.
Just
he
being
had the holy
downright
temple in Jerusalem
disrespectful. Fair
converted
use.
into a temple of Zeus, within which he personally spilled the blood of a pig, a deeply sacrilegious ritual to the Judaic faith. The king declared that the Jewish people should begin worshipping the Greek gods. Hellenized Jews accepted these changes, but many others did not, resolving instead to fight. It is here that the Maccabees enter our story. Our story now shifts to the small Judean town of Modin, where a local priest, Mattathias, and his 5 sons lived. They belonged to the relatively minor Hasmonean family and were deeply Orthodox Jews who had remained true to every tenet of their religion, even as their countrymen became increasingly assimilated into Greek culture. Sometime in 167 BC, a Seleucid official arrived in Modin and compelled the townsfolk to offer a sacrifice to the Greek.
So yeah, like he said, the Hasmonean dynasty, definitely the Maccabean family had some tie to the Hasmonean dynasty. So, you know, they were pretty known and some would say powerful family themselves. And, you know, the Seleucid dynasty was there as well, or as he called it, the Seleucid. But let's keep going. Again, this is more a secular, worldly view of the history, and we'll continue with the scriptural portion in a moment.
Gods. Mattathias refused to make this offering, and another one of the townsfolk, a Hellenized Jew, stepped forth to Zeus, within which he personally spilled the blood of a pig, a deeply sacrilegious a fort named Acra on the nearby hill of Ophel, so everyone could gaze upwards and see the symbol of King Antiochus's power. Rather than leaving good enough alone, Antiochus began to actively exterminate Judaism, forbidding the people of Judea from observing the Sabbath, circumcising their sons, or performing other rituals. He had the Holy Temple in Jerusalem converted into a temple of Zeus, within which he personally spilled the blood of a pig, a deeply sacrilegious ritual to the Judaic faith. The king declared that the Jewish people should begin worshipping the Greek gods. Hellenized Jews accepted these changes, but many others did not, resolving instead to fight. It is here that the Maccabees enter our story. Our story now shifts to the small Judean town of Modin, where a local priest, Mattathias, and his 5 sons lived. They belonged to the relatively minor Hasmonean family, and were deeply Orthodox Jews, who had remained true to every tenet of their religion, even as their countrymen became increasingly assimilated into Greek culture. Sometime in 167 BC, a Seleucid official arrived in Modin and compelled the townsfolk to offer a sacrifice to the Greek gods. Mattathias refused to make this offering, and another one of the townsfolk, a Hellenized Jew, stepped forth to do so in his place. Flying into a rage, Mattathias drew his knife and murdered his countrymen before he could perform the ritual. The priest then cut down the Seleucid official as well, and destroyed the pagan altar for good measure. Knowing they would be branded outlaws, Mattathias and his 5 sons fled into the nearby hills, followed by many like-minded Orthodox Jews known as the Hasidim. From there, the fight had begun. While Mattathias died sometime in 166 BC from causes unknown, he would be succeeded by his 3rd son, Judah, a dynamic young commander who, through a mixture of ferocity, ruthlessness, and bravery, would come to be known as Maccabees, a word deriving from the Aramaic Maccaba, the hammer. At the early stages, the rebellion was not a struggle between Jews and Greeks, but a civil conflict between pro- and anti-Hellenic Jews. The Maccabees began their movement with a terror campaign, launching lightning raids upon predominantly Jewish towns.
So as he's explaining, they were initially the Hasmoneans, and now after this, they started being known as the Hammers. Let's keep it going. Hammers of the Lord, baby.
Killed many of their own countrymen who they considered too Greek, burning down their homes and destroying the pagan altars where they worshipped. Most notably, they rounded up the sons of Hellenized Jews and had them forcefully circumcised. The message was simple: Greek culture was to be purged from Judea. Before long, the Maccabees had earned the attention of the military governor Apollonius, who resolved to crush the rebels before they could sow any more chaos. In 167 BC, after gathering a local army of around 2,000 men in Samaria, Apollonius marched south to the Gophna Hills, where it was said that the elusive Judah was hiding out. Here, the Maccabees proved they were capable of more than just murdering civilians and burning altars. Knowing they were outnumbered and out-equipped, Judah deliberately lured the enemy army deep into his native territory, where the hilly terrain made it impossible for the Seleucids to form up into their Macedonian phalanx. With only 600 men, The Maccabees surrounded and ambushed the Seleucid forces just outside the town of Wadi Haramir, routing them off the field. Apollonius was killed in the fighting, and Judah claimed the fallen commander's sword, wielding it as a symbol that his rebellion had been blessed by God. The Maccabees followed up their victory with another in 166 BC, ambushing an army of 4,000 Seleucids led by Seron at the Beth Horon mountain pass. These two victories would set the theme for much of the revolt, in which smaller, poorly armed contingents of Maccabean warriors would utilize terrain-based guerrilla warfare to consistently outwit the well-armed Seleucid armies that outnumbered them greatly. Later that year, Antiochus IV was forced to take the bulk of his armies eastwards to deal with a Parthian invasion, putting the local governor of Syria, Lysias, in charge of quashing the growing Jewish revolt with limited resources. Despite this, Lysias managed to field a significantly large army of some 10,000 professional Macedonian-trained soldiers. He put two experienced commanders, Gorgias and Nicator, in charge of this force and sent it into Judea. The Hellenes set up an entrenched camp at the town of Emmaus, while Maccabeus responded by leading around 3,000 Jewish warriors to the adjacent town of Mizpah, where they fasted and prayed to God to deliver them victory in the battle to come. In the days that followed, some of the local anti-Maccabean Jews informed the Seleucid commanders where Judah had set up his base. Seizing the opportunity to catch his enemy flat-footed, Gorgias rallied some 5,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry and marched for Mizpah. However, his heavily armoured Argyrespides were slow and cumbersome, and their presence was soon picked up on by Maccabean scouts. Rather than face Gorgias's force head-on, Judah decided rather ingeniously to abandon his camp, taking advantage of his army's speed and maneuverability to skirt around the expeditionary force and strike instead at their now more sparsely populated camp at Emmaus. Taken completely by surprise, the reserve forces in Emmaus were either slaughtered or routed, and their supplies looted or burned. After failing to find any rebels in Mizpah or the surrounding hinterlands, Gorgias returned to his camp, only to find it aflame. Seeing this, the morale of his army was crushed and they fled for the coast. Reeling from yet another decisive defeat, the high priest Menelaus in Jerusalem, with the support of Lysias, attempted to bring Judah and his cohort to the bargaining table, offering to repeal some of the more egregious anti-Judaism laws of Antiochus. However, these negotiations failed, for the Maccabees would accept nothing less than the total eradication of Hellenization in Judea. By 164 BC, Governor Lysias had taken it upon himself to assemble and lead an army of some 20,000 men in Antioch, leading them south through Idumea and the valleys east of Gaza to a town called Beth Zur, where he encamped his army in the local fortified citadel, hoping to strike at the Maccabees' southern flank. By this point, Judah Maccabeus had some 10,000 men under his command, his numbers having swelled as the reputation of his victories grew. Nevertheless, he was still outnumbered and outgunned by Lysias's army, so he stuck to tried and true tested methods to best his foe. Historical sources are vague on how the Battle of Beth Zur played out, but it seems evident that the Maccabees spent the next few months harassing the Seleucids through hit-and-run tactics, striking at foraging parties, patrols, and any platoon of Syrian Greeks unfortunate enough to be caught outside the town's citadel. This was never enough to earn a decisive victory, but it was enough to keep Lysias and his army consistently on the back foot. The status quo changed in late autumn, when in the Far East, the Seleucid Epiphanes contracted disease while campaigning against the Parthians and died. The monarch's death meant that his son, the 10-year-old Antiochus V, was now Basileus of the Seleucid Empire, and there would be no small amount of
crazy to get that much power handed to you and put in your lap at 10 years old. Jesus, let's keep going.
courtiers willing to, nevertheless, he was still outnumbered and outgunned by Lysias's army, so he stuck to tried and true tested methods to best his foe. Historical sources are vague on how the Battle of Beth Zur played out, but it seems evident that the Maccabees spent the next few months harassing the Seleucids through hit-and-run tactics, striking at foraging parties, patrols, and any platoon of Syrian Greeks unfortunate enough to be caught outside the town's citadel.
So definitely using some guerrilla warfare tactics to best their opponents.
Never enough to earn a decisive victory, but it was enough to keep Lysias and his army consistently on the back foot. The status quo changed in late autumn, when in the Far East, the Seleucid Epiphanes contracted disease while campaigning against the Parthians and died. The monarch's death meant that his son, the 10-year-old Antiochus V, was now Basileus of the Seleucid Empire, and there would be no small amount of courtiers willing to influence the young boy for personal gain. Suddenly, Lysias's priorities had shifted, and he was compelled to return to Antioch to secure control of the infant king in order to keep his power and influence in the royal court, which meant that the campaign in Judea was over. Due to his persistence, cunning, and some plain old luck, Judea Maccabeus was victorious once more. With his victory at Beth Zur, he was able to march his army more or less unopposed to Jerusalem, which, ironically, he was able to stride right into because the Seleucid governor Apollonius had destroyed its city walls a few years earlier. Following this, the Hellenized and other Seleucid loyalists retreated to Acre. Now firmly in control of the holy city, the Hammer of Judea entered the temple, destroying the altar to Zeus and the idols that had been erected during the reigns of Jason and Menelaus. His youngest brother, Jonathan Apphus, was installed as the new high priest of Judea. Among the sacred objects to be restored was the menorah, a golden candelabrum whose 7 branches represented knowledge and creation. It was supposed to be kept burning every night, but its light had been extinguished during the persecutions.
Here we go.
However, the temple had been so thoroughly pillaged that there was only enough oil to keep the candles of the menorah burning for 1 night.
Teach.
Despite this, once lit, the candles burned bright and true for 8 full days. This supposed miracle of God is the cornerstone.
Which means for 7 additional nights it burned, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Stone of Hanukkah, and to this day, when Jewish communities around the world light 8 candles on their menorahs, they commemorate each day the light burned for Judea Maccabeus and his freedom fighters. Jerusalem may have been taken, but the war was far from over. Seeking to keep his momentum, Judea besieged Acre in early 162 BC. He expected that Lysias, still locking horns with his political rivals in Antioch, would not bother sending a force to relieve the siege. He was wrong, and in a surprise to everyone, Lysias left Antioch with an army of some 50,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and at least 30 war elephants. Maccabeus had a respectable 20,000 warriors loyal to him, so upon hearing this news, he broke the siege of Acre and marched southwards, meeting his foe on the hills outside of the town of Beth Zachariah. Confident in his numbers, and expecting the Greeks to be wizened to his guerrilla warfare tactics by now, Judah opted to, for once, match the Seleucid army in a pitched battle. This was a dire mistake. The Jewish warriors were no match for the Macedonian phalanx in the open field.
Yeah, that phalanx ain't no joint.
War elephants were striking deep fear into the heart of Judah's troops.
Those are amazing.
In an attempt to inspire bravery in his men, the younger brother of Judah, Eleazar Haran, charged right into the Seleucid front lines, diving under the lumbering legs of an approaching elephant and stabbing into its soft underbelly. The beast was slain, but its corpse fell onto Eleazar, crushing the Hasmonean warrior in one of history's more spectacular deaths. Despite this brave sacrifice, the Maccabean forces were still routed and driven off the field.
Damn.
Lysias was not able to savor this victory for long. For in the following year, the hammer struck back, winning a minor victory over a Seleucid army at Edessa. This was not a crushing blow to the Seleucids, but once more Lysias had to return to Antioch to deal with his rivals. He was forced to compromise with the Maccabees, repealing much of Antiochus IV's religious laws to placate his foe, before retreating out of Judea. Taking advantage of this reprieve, Judah sent envoys to Rome. As they had a vested interest in keeping their Seleucid rivals weak, the Romans signed a treaty of mutual defense with the Maccabees in 161 BC, which legitimized Judah Maccabeus as a legitimate ruler of an independent Jewish state. Meanwhile, over in Antioch, the situation was growing volatile. King Demetrius I Soter rose to power following a political coup that saw the murder of boy King Antiochus V and his chief supporter Lysias. King Demetrius turned out to be more aggressive than his predecessors, and ignoring the Roman-Judean treaty, he dispatched one of his top generals, Maccabees, at the head of 22,000 men to retake Judea. Maccabees managed to march right up to the gates of Jerusalem unopposed, catching Judah Maccabeus completely by surprise. He had only 3,000 men with him, and to make matters worse, most of them fled the city upon seeing how direly outnumbered they were. Left with only 1,000 or so men, the Hammer of Israel opted to go out in a blaze of glory, charging out into the field outnumbered 20 to 1. Despite a valiant attempt, Judah and his men were overwhelmed and cut down to a man. Judah's brothers Simeon and Jonathan continued to fight on, eventually defeating Maccabees and retaking Jerusalem in the years that followed. The brothers and their successors would continue to fight against the Seleucids for 2 more decades, before the declining Hellenistic Empire became mired in its own internal corruption and civil wars. In 141 BC, Judea came fully under the control of the Hasmonean dynasty, and the descendants of Judah Maccabeus and his brothers would rule it as a fully independent kingdom for a time. It is worth noting that even after this successful bid for independence, elements of the Hellenistic language and culture remained visible in Jewish society for centuries, especially after they were expelled from their homeland by the Romans after the Great Jewish Rebellion, and forced to integrate as a diaspora community across a notoriously Greek-loving Roman Empire. The Maccabean revolt has a somewhat mixed legacy. Were Judah and his followers brave freedom fighters, risking everything to preserve their culture and faith against an oppressive imperial regime? Or were they religious zealots whose desire to force a rigidly theocratic society upon all Jewish peoples taints what could have been a noble legacy? Whatever the case, their impact on world history cannot be denied.
Word, shout to kings and generals for that. Shout to kings and generals for that. Yeah, man. Let's check out this one more. Let's get some edification. Let's go. Oh, sorry, wrong. Wrong video. Wrong video. Wrong video. Sorry. Sorry, gang. That's the same. What the heck? I'm not sure what happened to my other part of my presentation, family. Hold on 1 second. Okay, here we go. Let's check this out.
A quick note before the proper start of the video. If you are a regular
and again, guys, we already see the flag in the background, so we understand the perspective that this may come with is slightly, skewed and agendized. But I mean, that's all historians, all people have their perspectives. I have my perspective. I have my skew. I have my slants based on the research and things that I've done, and also the things that I am my faith and things I believe in. So, understand that we'll listen and, we'll take what we can from this, and we'll continue to dig. Let's go.
Viewer of this channel, then I have a survey that I would like you to take, link down in the description below. The survey will help the temple and would be ruled by the Achaemenid. After Cyrus the Great conquered the city of Babylon in 539 BCE, the Jewish captives there were allowed to return to Jerusalem and the land of Judah, and allowed to.
Let's rewind it back just a little bit more.
If you'd like to have some kind of influence over that over the year of 2022, then go ahead and fill that down in the description below, top link. And without further ado, let's get on to the history. After Cyrus the Great conquered the city of Babylon in 539 BCE, the Jewish captives there were allowed to return to Jerusalem and the land of Judah, and allowed to rebuild the temple, and would be ruled by the Achaemenid Persian Empire for the next 200 years. The Hebrew Bible tells stories of the rebuilding of the temple, as well as of a future Messiah to come. And this is where the canonical story of the Hebrew Bible ends. And unfortunately, this is where our sources grow dark for Jewish history. But to supplant this lack, we have the rest of the region to look at. During the 400s BCE, a series of wars were fought between the Achaemenid Empire and the city-states of Greece. They went back and forth, launching offensives and retribution campaigns. This was followed by the Peloponnesian War, in which the city-states of Athens and Sparta competed for dominance of Greece. The Persians also experienced civil wars in the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE, thereby weakening both. This allowed the Macedonians, led by Philip II, to conquer Greece, and after his death, his son, Alexander III, better known as the Great, would go on to conquer the Persian Empire. The Greeks were a seafaring peoples, so they knew a fair amount about the coastal peoples of the Levant, such as the Phoenicians. But the Jews they had little to no awareness of. Greek writers prior to the Alexandrian conquest sometimes referenced events going on around Jerusalem, but they didn't know the people there as Jews. More often than not, they referred to them as Syrians. There were Jewish populations outside of Judea at the time, such as those who remained behind in Babylon after the Persian conquest, as well as the descendants of those who fled to Egypt after the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem in 586. There were Jewish mercenaries serving in armies of the Egyptian pharaohs, as well as in the armies of Alexander the Great himself. Alexander the Great is said to have entered the city of Jerusalem in 333, with one myth claiming that he made an offering in the temple after entering the Holy of Holies. There's another myth claiming that Alexander converted to Judaism, but there is zero evidence for it, and plenty of evidence contradicting it. If there's any validity to it at all, the most you could postulate is that he added the Hebrew god to his already voluminous pantheon, which, I should remind you, included himself. The Greek encounter with the Jews sparked a flurry of interest among Greek writers, the same way the first encounter between European and Amerindians sparked interest in Europe in the 16th century. Greek philosophers had numerous theories about human nature, the origins of religion, and organized society. They believed that those untouched by civilization, aka Greek culture, must have preserved the purity of man's first religion and the perfect societal structure. Another trait the Greeks, and to a lesser extent the Romans, had was nature, the origins of religion, and organized writers, the same way the first encounter between European and Amerindians sparked interest in Europe in the 16th century. Greek philosophers had numerous theories about human nature, the origins of religion, and organized society. They believed that those untouched by civilization, aka Greek culture, must have preserved the purity of man's first religion and the perfect societal structure. Another trait the Greeks, and to a lesser extent the Romans, had was a belief in spiritual universalism. Whenever the Greeks visited a foreign land and encountered the worshippers of a foreign god, they had a tendency of drawing connections between their own gods and whoever these foreigners were worshipping. Basically, the Greeks believed that these foreigners were worshipping the same god that they were, just under a different name. And if this group had been untouched by civilization, then that meant that they were worshipping and the perfect societal structure. Another trait the Greeks, and to a lesser extent the Romans, had was a belief in spiritual universalism. Whenever the Greeks visited a foreign land and encountered the worshippers of a foreign god, they had a tendency of drawing connections between their own gods and whoever these foreigners were worshipping. Basically, the Greeks believed that these foreigners were worshipping the same god that they were, just under a different name. And if this group had been untouched by civilization, then that meant that they were worshiping.
That may not be that inaccurate, though.
Remind you, included himself. The Greek encounter with the Jews sparked a flurry of interest among Greek writers, the same way the first encounter between European and Amerindians sparked interest in Europe in the 16th century. Greek philosophers had numerous theories about human nature, the origins of religion, and organized society. They believed that those untouched by civilization, aka Greek culture, must have preserved the purity of man's first religion and the perfect societal structure. Another trait the Greeks, and to a lesser extent the Romans, had was a belief in spiritual universalism. Whenever the Greeks visited a foreign land and encountered the worshippers of a foreign god, they had a tendency of drawing connections between their own gods and whoever these foreigners were worshipping. Basically, the Greeks believed that these foreigners were worshipping the same god that they were, just under a different name. And if this group had been untouched by civilization, then that meant that they were worshipping a more primitive version of their gods or their religion than they were. But do you know what else is a sign of civilization? Clicking that subscribe button and hitting the bell icon to turn on notifications. And once you're feeling all civilized, why don't you go ahead and give this video a like and leave a comment down below. It's great for the...
Now remember guys, primitive doesn't always mean bad. It could just mean an earlier version, an antiquity version of the practice or customs that they have. So if, as he stated, their perspective would have been that they were worshiping almost, you could say, a purer version of the deities, the head deity that they believed in. So let's keep it going.
Algorithm. Of course, even more civilized than that is buying merch from the Casual Historian Redbubble store. You can get art prints like this Viva la Abolición poster. Now that all that YouTuber stuff is out of the way, let's get back to the history. Some Greek philosophers began postulating that the ancient forms of their philosophy had been given to them by the ancient Hebrews. One of the students of Aristotle, Clearchus, claimed that an ancient Jewish sage had introduced the concept of the immortal soul found in Plato. Another student of Aristotle, Hermippus, would also claim the Pythagorean cult's conception of the soul and immortality was borrowed from the Jews. The problem with these theories, however, is that there is no known contact between Jews and the Greeks prior to Alexander's conquests. The claims of these philosophers are based on conversations they claim to have had with Aristotle, for which we have no evidence. But that didn't stop the Greeks from using the Jews to justify whatever theories about anything they had. They interpreted the Jews' worship of a single god, whom they referred to as Heavenly Father, as proof that the original religion of humanity must have been sky worship. This idea spilled into the absolutely fallacious belief that the Jews conducted their religious festivals at night under the stars. They also saw the Jews as having the ideal form of societal organization. At this time, the religious authorities of the temple, namely the high priest,
they saw the Hebrews had the ideal form of societal organization. Let's keep going.
They interpreted the Jews' worship of a single god, whom they referred to as Heavenly Father, as proof that the original religion of humanity must have been sky worship. This idea spilled into the absolutely fallacious belief that the Jews conducted their religious festivals at night under the stars. They also saw the Jews as having the ideal form of societal organization. At this time, the religious authorities of the temple, namely the high priest, were the leading governors of Judea during the Persian and later the Hellenist period. The Greeks interpreted the priests as wise sages and saw in them the philosopher kings that Plato idealized. Theophrastus, a student of both Plato and Aristotle, referred to the Jews as a philosophical race. However, this enamoration with the Jews wouldn't last forever, as the more exclusionary aspects of the Jewish religion would make themselves known. The fact that they actually worshipped inside a closed-off temple, rather than in the open air like the Greeks did, would make Greek rulers suspicious of insurrectionary plots. Their refusal to eat pork or shellfish made them difficult house guests. Their insistence on not working every seventh day or circumcising their newborn boys felt like superstitious nonsense. But the final straw was probably the monotheism. Whereas the Greeks viewed all religions as reflections of the same divine truth, the Jews claimed a monopoly on divine revelation. There may have been room for Yahweh amongst the Olympians, but there was no room for the Olympians in the Holy of Holies. The Persians had allowed the Jews to maintain cultural hegemony over Judea without much oversight. The Greeks, in contrast, would be much more active in disseminating their culture over the peoples they conquered. After his death in 323, Alexander the Great's empire fractured, with his leading generals carving out domains for themselves where they would try to Hellenize their respective realms. You had Cassander in Greece and Macedon, Lysimachus in Thrace and Asia Minor, Ptolemy in Egypt, and Seleucus in Syria and Persia. Ptolemy had a Jewish population within his borders. Not only did he have a Jewish cavalry in his army, there was already a Jewish community in Egypt. and Seleucus had a Jewish community of his own in Babylon.
For those people that try to say the Hebrews were never in Egypt,
Active in disseminating their culture over the peoples they conquered. After his death in 323, Alexander the Great's empire fractured, with his leading generals carving out domains for themselves where they would try to Hellenize their respective realms. You had Cassander in Greece and Macedon, Lysimachus in Thrace and Asia Minor, Ptolemy in Egypt, and Seleucus in Syria and Persia.
though we know where the real Egypt is at. Let's go.
Ptolemy had a Jewish population within his borders. Not only did he have a Jewish cavalry in his army, there was already a Jewish community in Egypt. And Seleucus had a Jewish community of his own in Babylon. The former lands of Israel would be traded back and forth between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies for a century in a series of wars, with Jewish mercenaries and militias picking different sides depending on the conflict. The practice of Judaism varied depending on which empire was ruling you at the time. Under the Seleucids, the holiday of Passover emphasized the anti-Egyptian nature of the Exodus story, and when one side controlled Jerusalem, the other distrusted the Jews living within its own borders. During this time, both powers pushed Greek culture into their regions, and portions of the Jewish population were supportive of it. The Greeks built temples to their own gods, amphitheaters rehearsing Greek plays, as well as gymnasiums where Jewish athletes would perform in the nude like their Greek counterparts. Some would even have surgical procedures done to disguise the scars from their circumcisions in order to blend in with the Greeks. One of the few bright spots for Jews was in the translation of Hebrew scriptures into Greek. These translations, known as the Septuagint, would be the outside world's only direct exposure to the Jewish religion until the time of Christianity. There are also issues with the translations, such as using much softer language in regard to the pagans, which is why later Jewish communities wouldn't use these translations for their versions of the Tanakh. There are also disputes over why the translation was made in the first place. The most widespread story is that this translation was commissioned by the Ptolemies for the Library of Alexandria. However, some scholars argue that the true purpose was to evangelize to the Jewish diaspora living in Egypt who could only speak Greek. Although we mostly hear about how the Jews were becoming more culturally Greek, there was cultural transmission going the other way as well. Greeks around the Mediterranean, mostly located in big cities, converted to Judaism for various reasons, be it personal, marriage, or an attraction to the culture. It was during this time that some of the later books of the Hebrew Bible were written. A peculiar example of this was the book of Jonah. Jonah was a minor prophet whom God called upon to preach to the city of Nineveh and repent for their wicked ways. After attempting to avoid his calling and taking a detour inside the belly of a giant fish, he arrives in Nineveh, where he is eventually successful in getting the city to repent of their sinful ways and live in accordance with God's law. This story kind of acts as an inversion of the Sodom and Gomorrah story in Genesis, where God calls on Abraham to save the cities, but fails. Something to notice, though, is that the people of Nineveh don't reject their own gods and convert to Judaism, but rather adopt Jewish morality, and in exchange, God does not destroy the city. This story echoes some of the same lessons from the Babylonian captivity, where the Jews were called upon to try and bring their oppressors into more righteous behavior. In it, we see the future attitude of Jews living outside of Israel, where they don't push conversion on those that live around them, but do encourage moral behavior. We begin to see Jewish writers defending their religion against the Greeks, and doing so in arguments rooted in Greek philosophy. An example of this would be Yeshua ben Sira, a very traditionalist Jew who was the first Jewish author to explicitly put his name on his own work. In his writings, he emphasized the individual responsibility for one's sins, and saw the law as a tool for living a moral life, which may have appealed to some Greeks. We also see Greek words enter into the Jewish cultural life, such as the word synagogue, which is derived from the Greek word for assembly. The synagogue would become the center for Jewish life in the diaspora communities, as well as for any Jew living too far from Jerusalem. In larger cities, these synagogues were governed by councils of elders that would eventually be referred to as Sanhedrin. They would serve as holders of knowledge for Jewish communities and settle legal and social disputes within that community. They would take more explicitly spiritual roles after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. During the First Syrian War fought between Ptolemy II and Antiochus I, a local Jewish notable in the Transjordan, Tobias, sided with the Egyptians, who defeated the Seleucids, thereby retaining control of Jerusalem. During the Third Syrian War, the high priest Onias II led a rebellion in Jerusalem against the Egyptians by refusing to pay tribute. Tobias' son Joseph, who was a nephew of Onias II, urged him to end the rebellion. The Egyptians would remove Onias II as high priest. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus claims that Josephus had bribed the Egyptians with money borrowed from the Samaritans.
You can't make this shit up.
During the First Syrian War fought between Ptolemy II and Antiochus I, a local Jewish notable in the Transjordan, Tobias, sided with the Egyptians, who who defeated the Seleucids, thereby retaining control of Jerusalem. During the Third Syrian War, the high priest Onias II led a rebellion in Jerusalem against the Egyptians by refusing to pay tribute. Tobias' son Joseph, who was a nephew of Onias II, urged him to end the rebellion. The Egyptians would remove Onias II as high priest. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus claims that Josephus had bribed the Egyptians with money borrowed from the Samaritans, but this is probably just anti-Samaritan propaganda. There may have been something to this propaganda, however, because during the Fourth Syrian War, Joseph's son, Hyrcanus, attempted to bribe the Egyptians into giving him his father's office as high priest. Hyrcanus may have made the offer to the Egyptians, believing his father was planning to switch allegiance to the Seleucids. Regardless of the reasons, the Seleucids gained control of Jerusalem in 200 BCE, during the Fifth Syrian War, under the reign of Antiochus III, who treated the Jews favorably. He recognized the Torah as the national law of Judea and allowed the high priest to act as a governor of the province. Antiochus III had his eyes westward, wanting to take on Rome for control of the Mediterranean. And his excuse came when a recently defeated Hannibal arrived in Syria, so the Seleucids invaded Greece as a stepping stone to Italy. But the Romans followed them in and defeated them. After his defeat, Antiochus had to retreat back into Asia Minor and give his son and successor, the future Antiochus IV, over to the Romans as a hostage. After his father's death, Antiochus IV was allowed to return to Syria, and he was determined to Hellenize his domains. Upon his ascension, the high priest Onias III is removed from his office and replaced with his brother, Jason, who bribed Antiochus IV with promises of more tax revenue. As high priest, he pushed the Seleucid policy of Hellenization further. Reacting negatively to this embrace of Greek culture was a political faction known as the Hasidim. These were extremely conservative Jews who lived in the countryside and opposed all forms of Hellenism. On the other side were the Antiochites, those who supported further Hellenization and rejected Jewish culture and religion to one degree or another. These would form the primary sides in the soon-to-come civil war. The high priest Jason would be replaced by Menelaus, who was a more fervent Hellenist than Jason, and promised even greater tax revenue to Antiochus IV. Jason, a descendant of the Tobiads, went to his family's estate in the Transjordan to recruit an army to retake Jerusalem from Menelaus. Even though the Hasidim had opposed Jason's ascension to the office, they opposed the new high priest even more, and so they sided with Jason and the Tobiads. While this Jewish civil war was brewing, Antiochus IV was trying to conquer Egypt, but the Romans had blocked him. On his way back to Syria, he and his general Apollonius occupied Jerusalem and slaughtered all of Menelaus' opponents, and destroyed the city walls. He then fortified the Acra citadel. The temple treasures were looted and statues to Zeus and other Olympian gods were put in their place. They sacrificed unclean animals on the altars within.
My God.
To inflame the ires of the non-Hellenists further, Antiochus banned circumcision, worship on the Sabbath, and other Jewish holidays. He and his general
Run that back. God damn it.
to one degree or another. These would form the primary sides in the soon-to-come civil war. He was allowed to return to Syria, and he was determined to Hellenize his domains. Upon his ascension, the high priest Onias III is removed from his office and replaced with his brother, Jason, who bribed Antiochus IV with promises of more tax revenue. As high priest, he pushed the Seleucid policy of Hellenization further. Reacting negatively to this embrace of Greek culture was a political faction known as the Hasidim. These were extremely conservative Jews who lived in the countryside and opposed all forms of Hellenism. On the other side were the Antiochites, those who supported further Hellenization and rejected Jewish culture and religion to one degree or another. These would form the primary sides in the soon-to-come civil war. The high priest Jason would be replaced by Menelaus, who was a more fervent Hellenist than Jason, and promised even greater tax revenue to Antiochus IV. Jason, a descendant of the Tobiads, went to his family's estate in the Transjordan to recruit an army to retake Jerusalem from Menelaus. Even though the Hasidim had opposed Jason's ascension to the office, they opposed the new high priest even more, and so they sided with Jason and the Tobiads. While this Jewish civil war was brewing, Antiochus IV was trying to conquer Egypt, but the Romans had blocked him. On his way back to Syria, he and his general Apollonius occupied Jerusalem and slaughtered all of Menelaus' opponents, and destroyed the city walls. He then fortified the Acra citadel. The temple treasures were looted and statues to Zeus and other Olympian gods were put in their place, and they sacrificed unclean animals on the altars within.
Not sacrificing unclean animals, come on.
Banned circumcision, worship on the Sabbath, and other Jewish holidays. He went further and destroyed copies of the Hebrew scriptures. These acts would provoke the Maccabean revolts. Agents of Antiochus IV went around Judea, building pagan worship sites and trying to force the locals into making sacrifices to these foreign gods. In the village of Modin, northwest of Jerusalem, the village priest, Mattathias, refused to participate in sacrifice. But when another local attempted to do so, Mattathias and his sons killed both the collaborator and the Antiochian official, after which they fled into the hills, where they would be joined by others, and wage a guerrilla war against the Seleucids. Mattathias would die a year into his revolt, and would be succeeded by his son Judah, who was known as the Maccabee, or the Hammer, from which the revolt would receive its name. The Maccabees would be joined by the Hasidim, greatly increasing their numbers. Initially, the revolt wasn't taken seriously. They would conduct hit-and-run raids into villages where pagan altars had been set up, and destroy them, along with any Antiochite collaborating with the Seleucids. The Maccabees captured Jerusalem in 164 BCE, except for the citadel of Acra, which was still held by the Seleucid soldiers and the Antiochites. Since they controlled the rest of the city, including the temple, they began the process of undesecrating it. This is also where we get the story of Hanukkah from, which I have a video about that you can watch later by checking the eye in the upper right. The Seleucid Empire had fallen to civil war at the time, with rival generals competing for power. One of these generals, Lysias, briefly besieged the city before making a peace deal with the Maccabees. Lysias agreed to repeal the anti-Jewish law set by Antiochus IV, and allowed the high priest to manage domestic affairs. Menelaus was executed and replaced by Alcimus, an appointee of Lysias. But the revolt would reignite when Alcimus began rounding up and executing the Hasidim. Judah Maccabee would die in battle, but was succeeded by his brother, Jonathan. Alcimus died in 159 and was not replaced. Jonathan made peace with the Seleucid claimant in 157, who made him governor of the region. Two other combatants, Demetrius I and Alexander Ballas, made treaties with him in 153, which allowed him to retake Jerusalem and be named high priest. Not everyone accepted Jonathan as high priest, especially the Hasidim.
Traditionally, the high priest was a descendant of Moses' brother Aaron, and more specifically, through his descendant Zadok, the high priest during the times of King David and Solomon. Jonathan was from the Hasmon family, not a descendant of Zadok, which meant his high priesthood was seen as illegitimate by more conservative Jews like the Hasidim. Despite the opposition, Jonathan coalesced the powers of both the temple and the governor and began acting more as a king. Despite technically being a vassal of the Seleucids, he would occasionally go to war with them in order to expand his domains within the empire. He also began reaching out to foreign powers such as Sparta and Rome. However, he would be captured and killed in battle by one of the rival claimants to the Seleucid throne in 143, after which he was succeeded by his brother Simon, the last of Mattathias' sons. Simon sided with Demetrius II in his war with the rival who had killed his brother, and in return Demetrius granted Judah freedom from taxation, which in the ancient world was tantamount to granting independence. And so, after decades of occupation, Simon starved out the fortress of Acra, which had been occupied by hostile powers since the time of Antiochus IV. There was once again an independent Jewish state, the last that would be seen until the 20th century.
Simon was formally made their leader in 141 by an assembly of elders and priests, formally founding the Hasmonean dynasty. But not everyone accepted this. He was high priest despite not being a descendant of Zadok, and he was claiming the title of king despite not being a descendant of David, and yet he united both offices into a single person.
But in 135, he was assassinated in a plot orchestrated by his son-in-law Ptolemy. He had been appointed the governor of Jericho by the Seleucid claimant Antiochus VII, and was married to Simon's daughter Maccabeus. During a banquet in which Simon and his two eldest sons attended, Ptolemy had them killed. But Simon's third son, John Hyrcanus, was not there. Ptolemy fled to the protection of the Seleucids. Antiochus VII would destroy the walls of Jerusalem and levy a tax on them, functionally returning them to vassal status. However, he would die in battle with the Parthians in 129, and was succeeded by his brother Demetrius II, who restored Judah's sovereignty. Under John Hyrcanus, we would see the evolution of Hasmonean politics into three main factions. There were the Hasmoneans themselves, who ruled Judea as both kings and high priests. The Hasidim evolved into the Pharisees, the conservative faction who dedicated itself to collecting the thoughts and opinions of priests and rabbis, and applying the laws of the Torah to situations and circumstances never addressed in the scriptures. The third faction were the Sadducees. These were the remnants of the Hellenist Jews. They were pro-Greek in foreign policy and wanted a limited application of the Torah to public policy. They were also used to physically maintain the temple, and Josephus would portray them as members of the Jewish upper class. There were other factions as well, but they tended to separate themselves from the politics of the Hasmoneans, such as the Essenes, who were also deeply conservative, living in communes outside of cities, voluntarily choosing poverty.
They were ascetics, abstaining from bodily pleasure and consuming only enough to survive, believing this would bring them spiritually closer to the divine. They were also apocalypticists, who were most famous for their association with the Dead Sea Scrolls. The politics of the Hasmonean dynasty would be a struggle between the Pharisees and the Sadducees over control of the Hasmonean dynasty, with the dynasty itself siding with one of the two factions depending on the situation. John Hyrcanus wanted to expand the domains of his kingdom, and did so by invading Edom and Hebron. He also invaded Samaria, and destroyed the Samaritan temple at Mount Gerizim. He also wanted to maintain good relations with Rome, which was supported by the Sadducees. He died in 104 and would be succeeded by his son, Aristobulus. Aristobulus was a Hellenist, and was very cruel to his own family, allegedly starving several, including his own mother, to death. He died after only a year in power, and was succeeded by his son, Alexander Jannaeus. He was considered to be mentally and emotionally unstable, but this didn't prevent him from also engaging in territorial expansion into the Transjordan and the Philistine coast. Unlike his older brother, who tried to Hellenize the Jews, Alexander would try to Judaize the other peoples he conquered. He also violated religious norms in other ways, such as pouring libations over himself rather than the offerings when making temple sacrifices. This sparked an insurrection by the Pharisees. The Pharisees reached out to the remnants of the Seleucids in Syria and called on them to invade Judea. This forced the Hasmoneans to retreat to the countryside to wage a guerrilla war against the Greeks. However, the Pharisees would later switch sides back to supporting the Hasmoneans, fearing Judea might lose its sovereignty once again. Reunited, the Jews were able to beat back the Seleucids, but Alexander was not in a forgiving mood. After the invasion was repulsed, he punished the Pharisees by rounding up 800 of them and having them crucified. Alexander would die in 76 BCE, and would be succeeded by his wife, Salome Alexandra. She managed to mend ties between the Hasmonean dynasty and the Pharisees, who were led by her brother, Simeon ben Shetta. Being a woman, she couldn't occupy the office of high priest, but her son, the future Hyrcanus II, could. Under her reign, the Pharisees set up an educational system that would teach the Torah to the peoples of Judea from a young age. Unfortunately, these changes couldn't stop the political dissolution after Salome's death in 67 BCE. A civil war broke out between the high priest Hyrcanus II and his brother, the would-be Aristobulus II, who would command the military. Hyrcanus was supported by the Pharisees, while Aristobulus was supported by the Sadducees. As the civil war raged, both sides made appeals to Pompey and Rome. They both met with representatives in Syria and tried to bribe him with gifts. They initially sided with Aristobulus, but after Pompey arrived in Syria himself, he decided to take the side of Hyrcanus, believing that he would make a better vassal than his brother. Aristobulus assembled his armies and resisted the Romans, but to no avail, and eventually surrendered. He tried to hand Jerusalem over to the Romans, but patriotic forces within it refused to comply, forcing Pompey to besiege the city. He eventually captured Jerusalem, but he didn't ransack it. He entered the Holy of Holies in the temple and left Hyrcanus II as the high priest. The city was intact, but Judea was now a vassal of the Roman Empire. If you don't want to miss the next installment of this series or any of my future videos, then you should click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon to turn on notifications. You could also follow me on Twitter where
Word. So that was a lot. That was good, man. That was some good information right there. Let's really quickly read something. Hold on one second before I do all that. Hold on. Can't be too careful.
Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
All the people with the backwards attitude, pointing fingers, and that's a bad excuse for sitting on your ass when you complain. Do things that you don't want to change. You ain't got no time for me, and I ain't got no sympathy for you.
Because people out here going crazy. All right, so I'm going to read a bit of the works of Flavius Josephus. Let me see where I can. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. I'm loving it. Yeah. Flavius Josephus on the Maccabees. Let's share this to the stage. Book 7. Flavius Josephus works, containing the interval of 170 years from the death of Alexander to the death of Judas Maccabeus. That's not what it says, Ghetto. You just be making stuff up. All right, then. Chapter 1. How Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, took Jerusalem and Judea by deceit and treachery and carried many of the Jews thence and planted them in it. I thought they weren't. You guys got to stop playing with me. Now, when Alexander, king of Macedon, put an end to the dominion of the Persians, he had settled the affairs in Judea after the forementioned manner. He ended his life, and his government fell among many. Antigonus obtained Asia, Seleucus, Babylon, and of the other nations which were there, Lysimachus, he governed the Hellespont, and Cassander possessed Macedonia, as did Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, seize upon Egypt. And while these princes ambitiously strove one against the other, every one for his own principality, it came to pass that there were continual wars, and those lasting wars too, and with the cities worse. And the cities were sufferers, and lost a great many of their inhabitants in these times of distress, insomuch that all Syria, by the means of Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, underwent the reverse of that denomination of savior which he then had. He also then seized upon Jerusalem, and for that end made use of deceit and treachery. For as he came into the city on a Sabbath day, as if he would offer sacrifice, he without any trouble gained the city, while the Jews did not oppose him, for they did not suspect him to be their enemy. Very interesting. Excuse me. And he gained it thus because they were free from suspicion of him, and because on that day they were at rest and quietness. And when he had gained it, he ruled over it in a cruel manner. Nay, Archides of, I'm going to say Cnidus, who wrote the Acts of Alexander's successor, reproaches us with superstition, as if we by it had lost our liberty, where he says thus: there is a nation called the nation of the Jews, who inhabit a city strong and great, named Jerusalem. These men took no care, but let it come into the hands of Ptolemy, as not willing to take arms, and thereby they submitted to be under a hard master, by reason of their unreasonable superstition. He's saying because they wouldn't fight on the Sabbath, that they had unreasonable superstitions. Think about that. This is what Agarchides relates to our nation. But when Ptolemy had taken a great many captives, both from the mountainous parts of Judea and from the places about Jerusalem and Samaria and the places near Mount Gerizim, he led them all into Egypt and settled there, as he knew that the people of Jerusalem were most faithful and observant of oaths and covenants. And this from the answer they made to Alexander when he sent an embassage, I'm going to similar to an embassy, to them after he had beaten Darius in battle. So he distributed many of them into garrisons, and at Alexandria gave them equal privileges of the Scythians with the Macedonians themselves. All right. And required of them to keep to take their oaths that they would keep their fidelity to posterity of those who committed these places to their care. Nay, there were not a few other Jews who, of their own accord, went into Egypt, as invited by the goodness of the soil and by the liberality of Ptolemy. However, there were disorders among their posterity with relation to the Samaritans, on account of their resolution to preserve that conduct of life which was delivered to them by their forefathers. So they wanted to continue living the way they were living, and they thereupon contended one with another with those of Jerusalem, said that their temple was holy, and they thereupon contended one with another, while those of Jerusalem said that their temple was holy, and resolved to send sacrifices thither. But the Samaritans were resolved that they should be sent to Mount Gerizim. Chapter 2, how Ptolemy and Philadelphus procured the laws of the Jews to be translated into Greek tongue, and set many captives free, and dedicated many gifts to God. When Alexander had reigned 12 years, and after him Ptolemy Soter 40 years, Philadelphus then took the kingdom of Egypt and held it 40 years within one. He procured the law to be interpreted, and set free those that were come from Jerusalem into Egypt, and were in slavery there, who were 120,000. This occasion was this: Demetrius Phelerens, who was library keeper to the king, was now endeavoring, if it were possible, to gather all the books that were in the habitable earth. So literally all the books everywhere that people habitate, and buying whatsoever was anywhere valuable or agreeable to the king's inclination, who was very earnestly set upon collecting of Demetrius's books, to which inclination of collects books his Demetrius was zealously subservient. So he was trying to get together a massive collection of all the information in the world that he could collect. And once Ptolemy asked him how many tens of thousands of books he had collected, he replied that he had already about 20 times 10,000. Sheesh. But that in a little time he should have 50 times 10,000. But he said he had been informed that there were many books of law, among the Jews worthy of inquiring after and worthy of the king's library. Ain't nothing wrong with a good library, man, full of good information, but which, being written in characters and in a dialect of their own, will cause no small pains in getting them translated into the Greek tongue, that the character in which they are written seems to be like that which is proper character of the Syrians, and that its sound when pronounced is like theirs also, and that its sound appears to be peculiar to themselves. Wherefore he said that nothing hindered why they might not get those books to be translated also, for while nothing is wanting that is necessary for that purpose, we may have their books also in this library. So the king thought that Demetrius was very zealous to procure him abundance of books, and that he suggested what was exceeding proper for him to do, and therefore he wrote to the Jewish high priest that he should act accordingly. Now there was one Aristeus, who was among the king's most intimate friends, and on account of his modesty very acceptable to him. This Aristeus resolved frequently and before now to petition the king that he would set all my fault, y'all. That he would set all the captive Jews in his kingdom free, and he thought this to be a convenient opportunity for making that petition. So he discoursed in the first place with the captains of the king's guard, Sacibius and Tarentum, Sacibius of Tarentum and Andreas, and persuaded them to assist him in what was going to intercede with the king, and what he was going to intercede with the king for. So pull up, help me talk to the king about this real quick. Accordingly, Aristeus embraced the same opinion with those that have been before mentioned, and went to the king and made the following speech to him. It is not fit for us, O king, to overlook things hastily or to deceive ourselves, but to lay the truth open. For since we have determined not only to get the laws of the Jews transcribed, but interpreted also for thy satisfaction. By what means can we do this, while so many of the Jews are now slaves in the kingdom? He's got an excellent point. Like, how can we try to get their books and, try to work out this, try to deal with them peaceably, while they see us as the people that have so many of their family, friends, and loved ones held captive in our dungeons? Do thou then what will be agreeable to thy magnanimity and to thy good nature. Free them from the miserable condition they are in, because that God who supported thy king was the author of their laws, as I have learned by particular inquiry. For both these people and we also worship the same God, the framer of all things. We call him, and that truly, by the name Zinpha, or life, or Jupiter, because he breathes life into all men. So this is what they were saying. They were calling the breather of life. Interesting. Because he breathes. Wherefore do thou restore these men to their own country, and this due to the honor of God, because these men pay a peculiarly excellent worship to him. Damn, I couldn't even say that word. And know this, Father, that though I be not of kin to them by birth, nor one of the same country with them, yet I do desire these favors to be done them, since all men are the workmanship of God, and I am sensible that he is well pleased with those that do good. I do therefore put this petition to thee, to do good to them. When Aristeus was saying thus, the king looked upon him with a cheerful and joyful countenance, and said, how many 10,000s dost thou suppose there are of such as want to be made free? To which Andreas replied, as he stood by, and said, a few more than 10 times 10,000. So 100,000 plus people want to be free. The king made answer, and is this a small gift that thou askest, Aristeus? You need to set free 100,000 people? Sheesh. But Sisybius and the rest that stood by said that he ought to offer such a thank offering as was worthy of his greatness of soul to that God who had given him his kingdom. With this answer he was much pleased, and gave order that when they paid the soldiers their wages, they should lay down 120 drachmae for every one of the slaves. And he promised to publish a magnificent decree about what they requested. So that was equivalent to 60 Jewish shekels, the 120 drachmae. Interesting. Okay. What they requested, pardon me, gang, pardon me, which should confirm what Aristeus had proposed, and especially what God willed should be done, whereby he said he would not only set those free who had been laid away captive by his father and his army, but those who were in his kingdom before, and those also and those also, if any such there were, who had been brought away since. And when they said that their redemption money would amount to above 400 talents, he agreed to it. He agreed it. A copy of which I decree have a copy of which I decree, I have determined to preserve that magnanimity, damn, I'm tired, of this king may be made known. Its contents were as follows. Let all those who were soldiers under our father and who, when they overrun Syria and Phoenicia and laid waste to Judea, took the Jews captive and made them slaves, and brought into them our cities and into this country, and then sold them, as also those that were in my kingdom before them. And if there be any that have lately been brought thither, be made free by that. Be made free by those that possess them, and let them accept 20 drachmae for every slave. So he's like, all right, listen, we'll set them free. Let's figure out a payment plan. This is the decree of Ptolemy, and we'll figure this out from there. And let the soldiers receive this redemption money with their pay. But so, you know, it's like reparations for the slaves for the enslaved people you're gonna let go. But the rest of the king's treasury, for I suppose that there were made captives without our father's consent and against equity, and that their country was harassed by the insolence of the soldiers, and that by removing them into Egypt, the soldiers have made a great profit by them, out of regard, therefore, to justice, and out of pity to those that have been tyrannized over contrary to equity, I enjoin those that have such Jews in their service to set them at liberty upon the receipt of the before mentioned sum, and that no one use any deceit about them, but obey what is here commanded. So, let them go. We gonna pay you a good amount, you know, for letting them go, and we'll take it from there. And I will that they give in their names within 3 days after the publication of this edict to such as are appointed to execute the same, and produce the slaves before them also, for I think it will be for the advantage of my affairs. And let everyone that will inform against those that do not obey this decree, and I will that their estates be confiscated into the king's treasury. When this decree was read to the king, it at first contained the rest that is here inserted, and only omitted those Jews that had formerly been brought, and those brought afterward, which had not been distinctly mentioned. So he added these clauses out of his humanity, and with great generosity. He also gave order that the payment, which was likely to be done in a hurry, should be divided among the king's ministers and among the officers of the treasury, so that way they could get it out to everybody as expeditiously, to borrow from T.I., as possible. Indubitably. When this was over, what the king had decreed was quickly brought to a conclusion, and this in no more than 7 days' time, the number of talents paid for the captives being above 460, and this because their masters required the 120 drachmae for the children also, king having in effect commanded that these should be paid for, when he said in his decree that they should receive the aforementioned sum for every slave. Hold on. Now when this had been done after so significant a manner according to the king's inclinations, he gave order to Demetrius to give him in writing his sentiments concerning the transcribing of the Jewish books. For no part of the administration is done rashly by these kings, but all things are managed with great circumspection. We got to look over this. We got to dot our I's and cross our T's. On which I account, I have subjoined a copy of the epistles and set down the multitude of the vessels sent as gifts to Jerusalem, and the construction of every one, that the exactness of the artificers workmanship as it appeared to those that saw them, and which workman made every vessel may be made manifest, and on this account of the excellency of the vessels themselves. Now the copy of the epistle was to this purpose, Demetrius, to the great king, when thou, O king, gavest me a charge concerning the collection of the books that were wanting to fill your library, and concerning the care that ought to be taken about such as are imperfect. I have used the utmost diligence about those matters. I did this quick, bro. Like, come on. And I let you know that we want the books of the Jewish legislation with some others, for they are written in the Hebrew characters, and being in the language of that nation are unknown to us. And again, as the historians were alluding to, many of the Greeks and Romans felt that the Hebrews had the most idyllic or the perfect societal setup, and they wanted to be able to implement things that were working well in that government structure and that societal setup into what they were doing. So they needed these books, and then they needed them translated. It hath also happened to them that they have been transcribed more carelessly than they should have been, because they have not had hitherto royal care taken about them. Now it is necessary that thou shouldest have accurate copies of them. And indeed this legislation is full of hidden wisdom, and entirely blameless, as being the legislation of God, for which cause it is, as Hacatius of Abdera says, that the poets and historians make no mention of it, nor of those men who led their lives according to it, since it is a holy law and ought not to be published by profane mouths. If then it please thee, O king, thou mayest write to the high priest of the Jews to send 6 of the elders out of every tribe, and those which are most skillful of the laws, that by their means we may learn the clear and agreeing sense of these books, and may obtain an accurate interpretation of their contents, and so may have such a collection of these as may be suitable to thy desire. Reasonable enough. When this epistle was sent to the king, he commanded that an epistle should be drawn up for Eleazar, the Jewish high priest, concerning these matters, and that they should inform him of the release of the Jews that had been in slavery among them. He also sent 50 talents of gold for the making of large basins and vials and cups, and an immense quantity of precious stones. He also gave order to those who had custody of the chest that contained those stones to give the artificers leave to choose out what sorts of them they pleased. He withal appointed that 100 talents in money should be sent to the temple for sacrifices and for other uses. Now I will give a description of the vessels and the manner of their construction, but not till after I have set down a copy of the epistle, which was written to Eleazar the high priest, who obtained that dignity on the occasion following it. When Onias the high priest was dead, his son Simon became his successor. He was called Simon the Just, because, as we heard about in the historical accounts that were given, because of both his piety towards God and his disposition to those of his own nation. When he was dead and had left a young son, who was called Onias, Simon's brother Eleazar, of whom we are speaking, took the high priesthood, and he it was to whom Ptolemy wrote, and that in the manner following: King Ptolemy to Eleazar the high priest sendeth greeting. There are many Jews who now dwell in my kingdom, whom the Persians, when they were in power, carried captives, took them in as slaves. These were honored by my father. Some of them he placed in the army, and gave them greater pay than ordinary. To others of them, when they came with him into Egypt, he committed his garrisons, threw them in jail, and the guarding of them, that they might be a terror to the Egyptians. And when I had taken the government, I treated all men with humanity, and especially those that are thy fellow citizens, of whom I have set free above 100,000 that were slaves, and paid the price of their redemption to their masters out of my own revenues. And those that are of a fit age I have admitted into the number of my soldiers, and for such as are capable of being faithful to me and proper for my court, I have put them in such a post, as thinking this kindness done to them to be a very great and an acceptable gift, which I devote to God for his providence over me, and as I am desirous to do what will be grateful to these and to all the other Jews that in the habitable earth, meaning the parts of the earth that people can live in. I have determined to procure an interpretation of your law, and to have it translated out of the Hebrew into Greek, and to be reposited in my library. So he's like, yo, he trying to butter him up in his letter, like, listen, man, we treated your people better than the Persians did when the Persians enslaved them. We put people that were suitable to work. We didn't throw them in the garrisons and lock them away and do all these things the Persians did. I have freed your people, and I paid the cost for freeing those people. Now I have but a small favor to ask for freeing 100,000 of your people. I put them into my military after I freed them. So we immediately put them to work in the military and in my court. So they won't just be vagabonds with nothing to do and no pursuits to use to keep them productive and constructive members of the society. Thou wilt therefore do well to choose out and send to me men of good character, whom are now elders in age and 6 in number out of every tribe. These by their age must be skillful in the laws, and of abilities to make an accurate interpretation of them. And when this shall be finished, I shall think that I have done a work glorious to myself. And I have sent to thee Andreas, the captain of my guard, and Aristeus, men whom I have in very great esteem. I'll also send you some of my workers to help you, by whom I have sent those first fruits which I have dedicated to the temple. Oh, he's also dedicating first fruits, sheesh, which I have dedicated to the temple and to the sacrifices and to the other uses. And I mean, we were reading about this, how they were willing. I mean, we were seeing this in the history presentations, that they were willing to accept the culture. As we know, I mean, most people who've read anything about Roman and Greeks know they were open and willing to accepting other people's cultures as a way to make it easier for people to live civilly among them. Into the sacrifices, and to the other uses, to the value of 100 talents. And if thou wilt send us to let us know what thou wouldest have farther, thou wilt do a thing acceptable to me. Gang, let's take a pause right here. We're in part 6 of this chapter. Flavius Josephus. Let me write that down. This is going to be very good, a lot of very powerful information. So 6, and we'll come right back to this, gang. I'm gonna take a break right here. definitely turn on your notification bells so you are notified when we get back into this Maccabean Hanukkah history, and then also checking out the scriptural parts as well, because that's what we do here, fam. Peace and love to the tribes. See you back shortly.